In 5, 4, 3, 2.
Welcome to this KOSA special presentation, Ctrl Z, a 6-part series where students edit our own textbooks and re-examine what we've been taught about history. I'm your host, Sarah Schechter, along with my panel,
Lila Kiaweth
and Metsi EO.
Joining us today, we welcome a very special guest, our history teacher, Miss Joshi.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming, Miss
Thanks for
Joshi.
coming.
Yeah. Miss Joshi is our world history and ethnic studies teacher. So our topic for this segment is redlining, which is defined by Merriam-Webster as the systematic denial of various services to residents of a specific, often racially associated neighborhoods or communities, either directly or through the selective raising of prices. Redlining practices can look like refusing loans or insurance to someone because they live in an area deemed low class or urban. This can lead to cyclical neighborhood poverty that lasts for generations. Racial discrimination and mortgage lending in the 1930s shaped the demographic and wealth patterns of American communities today. 3 out of 4 neighborhoods redlined on government maps 80 years ago continue to struggle economically.
So, Ms. Joshi, can you give us a little more information about that, about redlining in general?
Yeah, so redlining pretty much started, obviously there was in times of segregation and Jim Crow, there was redlining, but it wasn't really called that at the time. But it really started with FDR and the New Deal because he tried to reinvent the American way of living because of the Great Depression, right? So he tries to create new housing opportunities for neighborhoods so that he can get the community out of the Great Depression. So he comes up with a series of laws specific towards housing, and a lot of people actually look back on that time in history and say that the New Deal was something that is like a very important document that shapes our country today and still does. And so a lot of people regard this document and FDR as a president as kind of like a savior for the United States during the Great Depression. But really, the New Deal was starting redlining because it segregated neighborhoods automatically. So they would have neighborhoods in which they would only want to sell houses to white people. And so anytime that they saw even a successful family of color coming in to their community, they would automatically deny them housing rights, deny their applications, and therefore they were all kind of segregated into their own neighborhood. So that's really where redlining kind of starts. And then it progresses obviously throughout time because it's just a continuous cycle, which is what's in the definition of redlining, because you're continuously being denied those accesses, especially when you're in communities of privilege. It's actually, I took my first trip to the Midwest this past summer, and it was crazy just to see. I went to Wisconsin to visit some family, and it was crazy just to see the same neighborhood, but you could tell like when you were in the white community and when you were in the community of color, just in the same kind of block. So you actually see all of these examples in communities where you're in the same town, but in one neighborhood you have really nice houses, nice supermarkets, you have certain actually businesses open and available at certain times of the day, whereas you'll walk across the block or you'll go kind of like maybe a few miles over and it's in the same town and you're actually really shocked because they're the same town, but you will see a completely drastic difference. Like the buildings are run down, they don't have access to grocery stores, there's not different businesses open and available for them. So even that in itself was really eye-opening for me because a lot of the time in California you see it, but there in the Midwest, it was really drastic on how different it is, like on the same block. And so that's just an example of modern day, kind of how you can see redlining happening in communities.
That's really interesting.
You mentioned people basically systematically denying housing to people, which brings me to the Fair Housing Act of 1968. How do you believe that changed redlining or affected redlining, and do you believe it made a difference?
And we talk about this in ethnic studies. We actually did a whole project where we had to look at different laws that have actually been created to help communities of color and to help specifically African American communities. So like the Civil Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act and all of these different acts that have technically been put in place to offer support to these communities. But in reality, how I see a lot of these as very much like a checklist. Like, check, we did a Civil Rights Act, okay, we have their rights written down, but we're not really going to enforce it. And so the Fair Housing Act did do a few good things. Like, it did open certain communities maybe to opportunities that they didn't have before. But at the same time, if it's not being enforced, like through state laws, then nothing really is going to change. So a federal law can only do so much when the states really are the ones that have the power to enforce the law. So if you're not having people going into neighborhoods being like, hey, this neighborhood is completely segregated, let's change that, then nothing's really going to change, because it's always going to be cyclical. You're always going to have certain communities that have the same privileges, and they will always be passing that privilege down, and so you'll never create an integrated community that way. So yeah.
That was also one of my favorite parts of this year so far in ethnic studies. I mean, because we'd also talked briefly about, equity versus equality. So, I don't know, kind of providing people with equal, like the idea of providing people with equal starting lines, and the bootstrap theory of, pulling oneself up by their bootstraps in America, ignoring disadvantages. But also, one of our projects that we've been doing is finding books that are about or like for or by people of color living in the U.S. And I know that one of the students did a Raisin in the Sun last week, which I honestly didn't think about this until like right now, until you described redlining this way. But I mean, in the play, by Lauren Hansberry, there is a direct example of redlining practices when there's a real estate agent who comes to the family in the book, in the play, in the story, and offers them money not to move into a predominantly white neighborhood.
It's called Clybourne Park.
Yeah, Clybourne Park. Now I'm remembering. Thank you for that. And that's redlining practices, and I think that it's really interesting. One of the reasons that we chose it, this topic, is because it's so prevalent in every thing to do with housing, in America, and housing discrimination and the civil rights movement also. But and we see it in media all the time too, but we don't really talk about it or know what it is. So thank you.
Do you know any ways that people spoke out against redlining? Do you know about certain movements that were sparked during this era?
So there's been backlash, especially because people were outright getting denied for their housing applications, and so obviously people want to know, why are we getting denied? What is your legal basis for this? And if you actually go back and look at a lot of documentaries from that time period, you'll see ads being shown of, we want to keep this community the way it is, and actually an African American person moving here is going to degrade the value of our homes. So they actually said that to people, this is actually going to make our community worse and not bring in money, so you should just go to your own community so that both communities will thrive, is kind of the way that they spun things. Because if you moved an African American family into a white neighborhood, then white people wouldn't want to go live there, and then no one would be spending money in that community, and so that's how they spun things. So obviously there was backlash that came with it, but again, if you are in a cycle where you can't afford to even vote, or you can't afford to have those privileges to have your voice spoken, then you're not really going to get anywhere. And that's the whole issue with this, is that the people who are being most affected current day don't even have awareness. They don't know what redlining is. They're not being taught in school, this is redlining, this is what they're doing to your community. These kinds of things aren't taught. And so it's having the privilege of even knowing what these words mean and what the effect that they have. And if you're not open to that, or if you don't even have that access in your community, then you really aren't learning about it. So that it's kind of hard to see a movement take place when there's not really education on it in the first place. Yeah.
So just wanted to know.
That's an interesting topic. This is Miss Dolores. My parents bought a house in 1962 in the Piedmont area, and the bank didn't want to loan them the money, even though they were well overqualified. And the house was owned by two brothers. They hadn't lived in the house in 15 years. Their parents died. They didn't want it. But they liked my parents so much that they decided to allow my parents to pay them directly and not go through a bank. But my parents were, they were trying to redline them. They didn't want them in the area. And it was still a restricted area for blacks. It was restricted. And they went through a lot of different forms of harassment from the community, trying to get them to move out. And, well, I'm in the house to this day. So that, speaks volumes of who my parents were. But I think it's a shame that a lot of people, they don't even, like you said, they don't know that they're being redlined. And in fact, they are. Even when I applied for my first loan, and I think I had an over 800 credit score, my salary, it's a full-time radio personality. And yet they gave me a loan through a subsidiary company. It was Washington Mutual at the time. They're gone now. But they gave me a loan through one of their subsidiaries, and I really didn't know any better. I just thought, oh, okay. When I got my first bill, I was like, well, where's Washington Mutual's name? And when I called and they told me, oh, we got your loan through one of our subsidiaries, I'm like, why? So I went to our talk show host, who was, always doing topics just like you guys are, and he explained, and when I called them back, they switched me back to Washington Mutual. So
well, and the reason they do that is because they think, because of the way you look, that you're not going to be able to afford to pay the bills. Right. That's why they're like, well, we don't want to take ownership for this person because we don't know if they're going to be able to pay, and so we're going to do it through a different bank or a different loan system. So it's really just going based off of how you look. Like she said, you can have a great credit score and all of these great things, but they're just going
and
off
the money.
Of how you look.
I have the money,
and
so
they just will deny you from that.
And what exactly is a credit score?
So a credit score is pretty much you have to get a credit card to start building your credit score, and I will encourage you all to do this when you graduate, but it's pretty much, it's a score that shows how well you pay off your bills in a timely amount, and it takes into consideration also your debt, which kind of sucks, especially being a student. You're always going to have student loans for the most part, and so it takes that into effect, but really it just looks at how good are you at managing your money and paying off your credit card at a certain time and things like that. And people don't teach you about credit scores. This is kind of off topic, but honestly, they don't teach it to you because a lot of kids will just go get a credit card and spend a bunch of money, and they don't realize that score follows you your whole life. That's how you get an apartment. That's how you get a car and a house. That credit score is the first thing that people look at for you to even apply to anything.
Oh wow.
So just keep in mind, yeah.
Yeah, and even the promotion of financial literacy in schools connects. Yeah, it's so poor, but. I know that my brother is struggling with the future of crippling student debt right now. My mom always talks to him, and she's like, you need to fix this, and he's like, I don't know what this means. So that's sad, honestly.
Yeah.
But we'll figure it out. And also in reading, one of the things that came up was that home ownership is the number one method of accumulating wealth, which also kind of connects to how capitalism is inherently hurtful to people of color, and then also how the bootstrap theory proves itself completely ineffective.
Yeah.
And just to go back a little bit, to talk about the history of redlining and why it's called redlining, I thought it would be good to go over why that's the way it is for a little bit. So in the 1930s, government surveyors graded neighborhoods in 239 cities, and they color-coded them for best, blue, green for best, blue for still desirable, yellow for definitely declining, and then red for hazardous. So the red line areas were the ones local lenders discounted as credit risks, in large part because of the residents' racial and ethnic demographics, which is why, we're just talking about that solely based on subconscious biases and not even subconscious, racial discrimination. And they also took into account local amenities and home prices. And obviously those are the neighborhoods that were predominantly made up of African Americans and people of color. And anyone who was not Northern European white was considered to be a detraction from the value of the area.
Yeah. And we see that carry over in today when I think white families make 10 times more than African American families and 8 times that of Hispanic families. And it's just it's crazy. And that idea of the bootstrap theory and the American dream is impossible when you have things like redlining and the homeowners loan corp doing things like redlining, and 3 out of 4 of those neighborhoods today are still suffering from this.
Yeah, that continued until 1968, and the Fair Housing Act banned racial discrimination in housing. For 50 years after that, the lingering effects of redlining are still very, very clear. Because I read a few articles that talk about the pattern of economic and racial or residential segregation. It's still evident in most of the cities. And there was a list of the top 10 cities that were redlined in the 1930s, and those are still the cities today.
Ones,
yeah. So you really don't, it's not convoluted at all, or there's no kind of tricky map to make. It really proves itself clearly when you look at it. And nationally, nearly 2/3 of neighborhoods are deemed hazardous are inhabited by mostly minority residents, typically Black and Latino people, in research studies. And then also cities with more neighborhoods have significantly greater economic inequality. The wealth disparity is a serious problem in those cities, Baltimore, and I know that in Georgia there's a lot of cities.
Baltimore's bad. Georgia is too.
Yeah, Georgia was one of the problems for the state. In Florida, and Louisiana too. But like in New Orleans, it's really bad too. And then 91% of areas classified as the best in the 1930s remain middle to upper income today, and 85% of them are still predominantly white. So, I mean, yeah, when you look at the numbers and like facts.
Is it safe to say that like gentrification is related to redlining in a way?
Yeah, I think so, especially because redlining kind of is like the backbone in a sense of gentrification. Like gentrification is kind of not a new concept, but it's just a concept where like you can raise up prices enough so that people cannot afford to live there. Whereas redlining it's kind of the backbone of that, and even just saying, well, you can't even live here in the first place. Like we don't even want you here. So it's kind of they support each other in a way, but definitely gentrification I do think is more like politically acceptable than redlining. Like if you say redlining to people and explain what it is, like a lot of politicians or people would say like, actually no, we're against that or whatever. It's politically correct to say you're against redlining, whereas gentrification is seen as more socially acceptable because really you're just raising the rent and it's good for the community and blah blah blah. They use different ways to spin gentrification in a way that's more politically acceptable. And so I mean essentially you're doing the same thing just in different ways. So like redlining is obviously more upfront because they're going to deny you uphand, whereas gentrification it's like a slow process, but they're still trying to get you out the same way. So it's just two different ways of doing like similar things.
Okay.
Yeah. I know that like I just spoke for a while, sorry, but like that made me think of like the Southern strategy and like Lee Atwater, like the rephrasing really racist tactics. We just watched 13th by Ava DuVernay, like in English. I know I keep on talking about this, but I mean it really like showed how like tactics like slavery like practices are still prevalent, you know, in the US industrial like prison complex. And like what you just said, it seems to be kind of very similar with redlining and gentrification, what's acceptable to, you know, to say, and like the practices that are like still like, you know, in society that are completely like not, you know, acceptable, but like that are like widely regarded as like actions that are like acceptable.
And especially in the Bay Area, like just where we're living currently, I think people don't understand how gentrification is so like it's kind of like a way of being now in the Bay Area. It's actually just crazy just sitting, because I go on BART every day and sometimes I go into the city and it's crazy like seeing who gets off at each stop, because I take it all the way to the end at Richmond. And so it's just crazy just seeing the communities of people, and they all look the same, and it's every single day, and they get off at the same stop. And it's just like that in itself is a form of gentrification, and people don't even realize it. Like I'm just sitting on BART having this revelation of like, wow, these same people are getting off at the same stops every day. And it's like, as you get to that inner East Bay, you get all the communities of color because they've all been pushed out of like San Francisco and West Oakland. So you just like, it's something that we're seeing, and just even being in education, like a lot of us teachers can't stay in the Bay Area because you can't afford to buy a house here. In 10 years, like, am I going to be able to afford a house? Probably not. And so even that in itself is a form of gentrification that people don't really, like, make a connection to. So.
But also, I just want to bring up the fact that sometimes it's about education and valuing what you have. Yeah. And I ask people, is it gentrification if you're giving it away? Because you got a lot of people that owned home in West Oakland. I'm born and raised in Oakland. And when their parents died, they wanted the quick money. So they were quick to sell. To me, that's giving it away. Yeah. And they didn't think about down the road and how the value was going to go up, or how it would be a gateway for them to do X, Y, and Z. It was just, you know, mama did, let's sell the house. Yeah. And that really, really bothers me, because it's a lack of education and understanding where this whole community is going to be going 10 years from now. Yeah. So, you know, even with my parents' house, they bought it in 1962. If we would have sold it in the 1980s, we wouldn't have gotten the millions that these houses are worth now, but we held on. Whereas a lot of my friends I went to middle school with or elementary, they're all like, God, you guys still have your parents' house? Like, yeah. So sometimes people are just giving it away for the quick dollar, not understanding that later on down the road, because they weren't educated, or sometimes it's just they're just greedy. And they just want a quick buck. They don't see that it is going to be of some value, because you got a lot of people that moved out to all of the suburbs because they wanted to get away from us African Americans. So they left, and now they're tired of that long drive, and they're saying, okay, we're going to swap with you. So you go live in Sacramento and you go live in Antioch, and we're going to take these beautiful mansions in West Oakland and build them up. Yeah. And now they're worth all this money, and people are going, dang, we shouldn't have sold. You don't have no idea how many people I hear go, man, we shouldn't have sold grandma's house. Like,
And they don't, and obviously they're not educating certain people on that too, because they want them to sell their property,
Of
and
course.
then they want that money to go up, and for other people to buy it so that the wealth goes up. Because in any community where there's white people, the value automatically goes up.
Right.
Correct.
Exactly.
yeah. And they're doing it everywhere.
Yeah.
Because even in the 90s, when I first started working at my first radio station, a woman called and she said there was a man going through Compton and Watts offering to buy houses if they move out to Palmdale, Lancaster, which is like 50, 60 miles away.
Yeah.
And now they have most of the blacks out there. And they're calling that the throwaway land out there. And they've moved in to the Watts and Compton area, areas that I wouldn't even go in, before.
Yeah.
So, and that, and I took it with a grain of salt. I didn't think anything of it at the time when she told me that. She's like, Dolores, they just going through. I didn't think anything of it back then. It was just like, really? Oh, okay, bye. Next caller, and I wasn't doing a talk show or anything, but people call you and tell you what's happening in their neighborhood. But it was happening in the 90s. They started moving people out in LA, giving them quick money and we'll move you up there.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, it pays to be educated.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. I think also, like, not on the topic of not educating certain people, next week is the midterm elections. And I think we talked about in ethnic studies in your class about how the DMV will close, like, a day or a couple days before so that people can't get their identities, IDs, so that they can't vote. So people in communities of color can't vote, and that really affects the election. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so we were looking at specifically, and there's two big examples right now, which is in Georgia and Florida, I believe, in which they've actually weeks before the election or even months, they closed down DMVs in communities of color because they claim oh, well, no one comes here anyways, and we're just going to shut it down and move over to the next area and whatnot, and people cannot literally get an identification to vote. And so there's a huge issue with that, and we were talking about it in ethnic studies because people were like, well, how can a DMV close? There's always lines at the DMV, around here, we don't understand that. I'm like, well, what kind of jobs are these people for the most part working? They're not working 9-to-5
Right.
jobs. They're working construction jobs, they're working jobs that require manual labor that take, it's not a typical 9-to-5. So in the hours that the DMV is open, it's not accessible to people who work most of these jobs that can't even afford to take off time out of their day to go. And so that's how they take that advantage and say, okay, well, we're going to close this DMV down. And so the biggest thing that's happening, I think, right now in Georgia is that they're saying, if your social security number, card, and your ID don't exactly match, they're not going to give you a voting ID. They're refusing to give people unless it matches exactly. And so that's cutting out, 500,000 people in Georgia itself from voting. And then in Florida, I know they have a huge issue with ex-felons who have actually gone into rehabilitation programs so that they can actually integrate back into regular society, and that's 1.5 million ex-felons that are not being granted the access to vote. And of course, a lot of those people are people of color. And so that's just taking out millions of people out of your own state from voting just from little tactics like that are just loopholes that they can go through just to say, oh, you can't vote because your name doesn't match and we can't give you a voter ID. So
yeah, and also in Selma, Alabama, and in Oakland, they're both cities who have had problems with redlining, and now who have high rates of ex-felons who can't register to vote for I think it's 2 years after you've been incarcerated or on parole or anything pretty much as a felon. It's impossible for you to vote. So that's just another tactic of voter suppression that directly relates to redlining.
And we were saying too how in a lot of other countries, the day that you vote is actually a national holiday.
Wow.
Where you cannot, you have no excuse to not vote because you get the day off. And here they make it so that you only vote. I honestly need to figure out when I'm going to vote because I have to be at work all day. It's not something where I can just, most voting polls close at 6 o'clock. And they open at 7. Yeah, it doesn't make it convenient for people who work odd jobs or for people who work more than 8 hours a day to go vote. And so that in itself is kind of unacceptable. They're specifically targeting certain groups who can't afford to take an hour lunch break, who can't afford to take the day off to go vote. When in reality, it should. If you really say that voting is the most American thing you can do, then it should be a national holiday, and it's not.
Wow, that's good.
Yeah.
So, thank you for sharing that with us. we to sum up everything, we have summarized what redlining is. We have summarized what the voter suppression that's going on now, and how it affects us today in modern society. So,
Is there any way that you can give us any tips, or those who are listening, how we can combat any of this? Just any solutions, or I know there's no quick fix, but how can we help, mobilize people to where they're understanding of what even is going on?
I really do think that just educating people on their rights is the first step, because really if you don't know what your rights are, you can't even fight for them. And that's actually one of the things I did in college, was I went to a lot of Latino communities and translated, because they don't even have people who speak Spanish or people to translate for them. And so I would talk to a lot of families in Spanish, and they had no idea what was going on. So even little things like that, and especially because you all are so educated here at this school, take those and go to nonprofits and do an internship over the summer, or pursue this in your own spare time, because you are the ones that are going to be that are the most educated, and you just informing people of their rights just gets the conversation going in the first place. Because if they don't even know that these are their rights, then obviously they have nothing to fight for yet, because they aren't even aware of it. So even those little things, I think that it's just the people who are educated need to honestly make more of an effort to do more, because a lot of us get that education, we want to leave our communities because we've made it, but in reality you have to give back to where you came from. And so I just think having that education, you need to take it as a privilege upon yourself to really go tell people, hey, these are your rights too. We have people in government telling you that they're not, but let me show you that they are. And even that gets the conversation going. It can go a long way. So I just encourage people to take what you have and really use that.
And for a direct thing, you can go to EOYDC, which is the East Oakland youth center, and I know that I've done a few programs there, and then also Nia does from our school. But you can go in there and get educated, and then also try and give back to your communities. So there's a direct thing. Thank you for joining us on this week's segment, Redlining. I'm your host, Sarah Schechter.
I'm Metzi Eo.
And I'm Mila Kiawith.
And this is Ctrl Z, a show that re-examines how we tell history. Our next segment will focus on the internment of Japanese Americans in the 1940s in the Bay Area, part of California history that many people don't know about and that textbooks don't cover accurately. Tune in at 6 p.m. on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday on KOSAradio.org, where minds, words, music, and rhymes meet.